All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ann Kinseth. I'm the Director of Education here at the Meadows Museum. It's lovely to see so many of you back and some new faces for our final in our four-part Luis Martin lecture series in the humanities this fall. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you to silence your devices if you haven't done so already. And with that, I'd like to invite Kelly Donahue Wallace back to the podium.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thanks again to the museum for the invitation to speak as part of the Luis Martin lecture series. This time I brought with me my History of Prints class from UNT. So thanks to them for making the trek down to Dallas. Their reward is getting to see Miranda's wonderful exhibition upstairs and then to examine closely a bunch of Goya prints after the talk. So they are quite lucky. And right now they are waiting for their midterm grades. So they're all sort of giving me the stink eye that they don't have their grades back yet, but they did a good job. And I have to say, while I have this public forum, that in 23 years of teaching at UNT, this is the best group of students I've ever had. So congratulations to them. All right, and thank all of you for coming out in the rain. Braving 35E is not for the faint of heart when it is raining, but we made it. So to begin our final lecture in the series, I'm presenting material from an article that I published earlier this year in the Colonial Latin American Review, addressing portraits of nuns holding books. And before I gave a lecture on a similar topic a little while ago, I was talking to my father, who's a retired Spanish teacher who studied Latin America and lived in Mexico for many years. And he asked, "What's the topic of your talk?" And I said, "Nuns holding books." And he said, "Oh, okay." And I said, no, it's very exciting. So hopefully it will be more exciting than it sounds. So last time we set the stage for this, looking at the nuns in their natural habitat, tracing them from life to death, the choice of the convent, life within the convent, and then what happened as they died and fulfilled their destiny as the brides of Christ. And as I mentioned last time, much of the information about nuns' lives that we have came from these published biographies or vidas. So to get started, I want to return us to the topic of the nuns' biographies or vidas that I mentioned last time. And here I show you the exhibition's Vida of Sebastiana Josefa de la Santísima Trinidad and its engraved portrait that pictures the nun in her cell, kneeling before a small sculpture of Christ, separated from her by the cilice and scourge she used in her penitential acts. As a reminder, the published vidas, like Sor Juana's, started out as journals that she and other nuns kept at the behest of their confessors. These were then transformed into printed biographies, rewritten by male authors to inspire other women, but also published as the first step in building a case for sainthood. And several of the saints' lives in the exhibition likely got their start in that form. Despite discussing different women from different families and backgrounds, the Vidas offered a familiar and repetitive formula. They typically narrate the nun's life with special emphasis on her extreme piety from infancy even, the challenges she overcame to enter the convent, the outstanding life of selfless service and religious fervor she lived as a nun, her painful and sad death, and the post-mortem miracles she performed. Although we'll return to Sor Sebastiana's vida later in this presentation, let us begin with the biography of another nun. From her vida, we know that Sor Maria Inés de los Dolores, a blind and sickly woman, lived her entire life in a convent, yet took her vows only shortly before her death in 1728. Thanks to her exemplary life and the odor of sanctity, remember that suggestion that she might be a candidate for sainthood, her convent commissioned a portrait painting of her, which the painter was to execute while her body lay in the choir. And here on the right, I show you a Mexican painting of what that scene may have looked like, with the body of the 4th century mother of St. Augustine of Hippo, St. Monica, standing in for Inés. But the convent did not just order the painting made to remember their fallen sister. They also wanted to record her first miracle. According to her Vida, Inés's face became beautiful when she died and looked much younger than the 62 years she lived in excruciating pain. This type of supernatural phenomenon was unusual but not unknown, as several Mexican nuns similarly gained miraculous comeliness post-mortem. Yet when the painter came to record Inés's likeness, her exemplary modesty caused her face to swell and become disfigured. The painter saw none of its beauty, but as soon as he left, the lovely face returned. After several attempts, the painter finally gave up. It was only the engraver, whose work we see here, who was able to capture her good-looking likeness, as we see in this print created to accompany her published biography, or Vida. His printed material was uniquely suited to represent this deceased nun. But even the engraver took 2 tries to get it right. While the first edition of Inés's Vida was being printed, the engraver returned to the plate, reworking the image. As he refreshed the engraved lines to fix where the plate had begun to show, he revisited the face, changing the miraculously youthful face into one worthy of a modern cosmetics campaign. As we come in a little closer, we see the work she had done. The nose given a perky tip, the lips plumped and pursed, the eyes and eyebrows enlarged, and the cheeks lifted. And we see where the artist reworked her veil as well, giving it more lift, body, and movement like a luscious head of hair. And so what I'm talking about is you can still see the outline of the original veil there, and he's given it more volume and then added, rather than the straight fall of the veil on the right, he's added this sort of movement to it. But how is this possible? Why was it okay for the engraver to make these changes? Surely her biography needed a truthful image, the verdadero retrato it claims to be. And it is here that we begin to see how print came to be a tool in the packaging of exemplary female piety, a point easy to accept when we look at the exhibition upstairs. Print was used in the Spanish world to craft the image of ideal female piety, enclosure, and obedience, regardless of the reality of lived existence, and disseminated widely to readers seeking pious role models. That is, printed material, whether printed text or printed image, allowed for the strategic reinvention of Mexico's nuns in, as I shall explain later in this talk, a uniquely efficacious medium. In Inés's case, while we will discuss the text of her Vida shortly, we see right away that the illustration offered readers not only proof of her holiness, but also the possibility of their own divine reward for a life lived piously. Who doesn't want to look young and beautiful in eternity? So now, knowing how these books represented nuns' lives and played somewhat loosely with the notion of truth, I'd like to offer a rereading of the books that appear in so many of the nuns' painted portraits, arguing that they represent more than the fact that nuns possessed books. After all, the nuns' portraits are quite stingy with other signs, frequently consisting only of the habit and the profession accessories. So why include printed books? In this talk, we will consider the many meanings printed books held in the painted portraits, concluding that they were potent signs in a familiar and convenient package. Scholarship has, to this point, read books in nuns' portraits simply as evidence of how nuns spent their days, reading devotional literature and teaching the young girls placed in their care. This, to me, is a superficial reading. Yes, nuns are pictured with books because nuns read books and taught. Some scholarship has additionally drawn the parallel between the reading nuns and the Virgin Mary, who reads at the Annunciation, as seen in the nun's shield on Sor Juana's chest, here on the left. In fact, the earliest representations of the reading Virgin Mary were made for monks and nuns. So by reading, nuns are imitating Mary. This imitatio Mariae was, of course, the goal of female monasticism. But I'd like to consider those interpretations as a starting point for these images and suggest that the depiction of printed material in these works signified more than just the act of reading pious texts. But let us start with the obvious, with books as signs of reading. Mexican nuns were literate, and orders promoted or required reading. And if you ever have the opportunity, and I think in the exhibition, there's a novena where one of the nuns wrote soy de, and then the nun's name. So I belong to, and I have a collection as well, and many of them have that same inscription, handwritten, I belong to Sor Maria. In his manual on ideal Christian womanhood, Spanish 16th century writer Luis Vives advised that girls be taught to read. They should be given books that, quote, explain upbringing and customs, teach how to live, teach how to work according to virtue, direct reason, and finally, to show them to live without prejudice to herself or anyone else, end quote. In Mexico, Antonio Núñez de Miranda was Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz's confessor in the late 17th century. In his description of nuns' behavior, Núñez promoted a fundamental female literacy. As Stephanie Kirk explains, he mandated reading skills only sufficient for what Kirk calls essential spiritual and practical convent offices that he presented as part of a limited package of accomplishments such as embroidery and singing, designed to ensure the production of a model and hence docile nun, end quote. This basic literacy reflected, as Núñez wrote, the female brain's weakness, the individual's frailty, the curious ignorance of Latin, the difficulty and discomfort with the readings and instructions. He recommended reading the writings of Fray Luis de Granada, as well as the lives of St. Teresa of Avila and St. Ignatius of Loyola, and the Contemptus Mundi by Thomas à Kempis, along with novenas and prayer manuals. But Núñez himself makes a statement that problematizes the relationship of books in nuns' portraits. Why acquire these skills, you might think, he wrote, to parade them around? Absolutely not. You might keep them hidden and covered up and only take them out and use them when the convent might have need for them. So the books in nuns' portraits are certainly not hidden or covered up. So why does the convent need them to appear in these portraits? This is a point to which we will return by the end of this presentation. Next, in light of Núñez de Miranda's and other clerical authors' recommendations on reading material, we may ask what the women in these portraits are reading. The books in these works range from large volumes to small texts. The larger volumes usually rest on tables and appear with authors and abbesses, like Sor Juana in the last slide, or the abbess Ana Teresa Bonstedt on the left. The smaller texts are roughly quarto size, pretty much like the size of a piece of paper, and smaller. The volume might be closed, held open for reading with both hands, as in the last image, or mostly closed with a finger inserted between the pages, as both of these picture. We can choose, of course, to take size literally in these paintings and glean what these books are. An 18th century Spanish printer's manual explained that the largest books, folio-sized, or 12 by 9 inches roughly, like the books on Bonstedt's table on the left, were usually major memorials or other important scholarly or legal texts. The smaller quarto-sized books, 9 by 12 roughly, was used for a wide array of topics, from biographies to religious treatises, as was octavo, which is roughly 6 by 9 inches, although these tended to present more popular themes. Sextodecimo books, roughly 4 by 6 inches, like the book on the right, were almost always devotional texts, and the smallest, trigésimo segundo, roughly 3 by 5 inches, as appears in Bonstedt's hand, was the approximate size for small books of hours. The books in the nuns' paintings are predominantly quarto or smaller, and therefore skew toward biographies and devotional books. The books held in the hand are mostly the smallest sizes, but I would caution taking this literally in light of the awkwardness of holding a larger book in one hand and the challenge of painting a hand holding a large book. The size of the books in the nuns' hands in these paintings may be as much about the sitter's comfort and the artist's convenience as about the books typically printed in that size. But if taken at face value, the books painted into nuns' portraits are principally devotional texts. Then another reading of them is possible in light of the nun's role as a bride of Christ. Whether written about Mary, the saints, or Christ, the ultimate goal of devotional literature is to meditate on humanity's salvation through Christ's life, death, and resurrection. And the individual reader's relationship to Christ rests at the core of this genre, instructing the individual to pray in certain ways on certain days to Christ. Seen in this light, and in a type of painting that hails the nun's role as the bride of Christ, I posit that the books in the paintings, with so few other iconographic details, there's a real economy of signs in these paintings. I posit that the book is the bridegroom, held with the same hand that frequently also bears the wedding ring. It is held against the heart or the lower abdomen to suggest the sacred love and spiritual fecundity that are the fruits of this marriage, just as we saw Maria de la Luz Padilla hold her flowers against her fertile belly last week. The inserted finger, therefore, may be a rather juicy detail. Typically, fingers inserted into books held in portraits reference a frozen moment, an episode of reading interrupted by the portraitist, only to be resumed again once the painter was finished. But these are portraits of the profession, a ritual that did not include a few stolen moments for reading. Even if the nun did recite a textual passage from memory. So the interruption theory seems unlikely. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to follow this thread a little farther, borrowing from James Conlin's study of images of women reading. As Conlin writes, reading may be likened to a kiss, as, quote, the author's words become the reader's. He continues, as you read this writing, for example, the words that were on my lips inevitably become yours. Our lips meet and move in harmony, union not just of lips, but of ideas, spirits, and hearts. While your lips may or may not move as you read, the words certainly enter your body and echo in your mind. So as the nuns in the Mexican portraits read the word of God, do they not temporarily come into physical contact? Does he not enter them? This is echoed in Roland Barthes in The Pleasure of the Text. Drawing upon what happened to the Virgin Mary as she read in the moments before and during the Annunciation, Barthes suggested that the scene of any woman reading becomes, at least metaphorically, a scene of potential annunciation, a scene of sexual subversion in which progeny can happen without male input. I would certainly not go so far as to suggest that the nuns subversively conceived without male input in these paintings, but that the books signify a spiritual intimacy between Christ and his new brides. The choice to insert the finger into the pages commingles the woman and her husband. Most of the time it does so with the index finger. An 18th century Mexican treatise on Christian doctrine explained that each person's index finger, so named because it indicates and makes connections between one thing and another, is the sign of Christ's most holy humanity, his Santísima Humanidad. This is visualized in paintings of the doubting Thomas, inserting his finger into Christ's wound, proving his human death and divine resurrection. The thumb, according to the treatise, is the divinity of Christ, as he raises his own thumb alongside the index finger to make the sign of blessing, and we join index and thumb to make the sign of the cross. It stands to reason that the fingers that hold the book's printed pages in the nuns' portraits may operate similarly, as a shared action joining divinity and humanity, a kind of chaste consummation of the mystical marriage. Even when they do not touch, the book can serve as a point of union between Christ and his bride. In these two works, the book, the vehicle for their relationship, rests between husband and bride, interpolated visually between the nun and representations of her groom. Hence, even if we plumb the early readings of books in nuns' portraits as simple indices of devotional reading, we see that they play a more profound and symbolic role. But I would like to continue this line of inquiry and read the books specifically as printed material to consider how this changes our interpretation. To do so, let's begin with what early modern people thought about the printed material that they saw. Since prints began to be made in Europe around the year 1400 and the invention of movable type in 1450, printed material was viewed as highly efficient for instruction. For one, the desire to learn motivated the production and consumption of printed texts and images. People used them to learn, as argued by William Ivins and his celebration of the exactly repeatable pictorial statement, or ERPS, as we call it in my class. But soon, in an interesting twist, people began to think that learners learned better from printed materials than from other types, and that learning was indelible. It couldn't be undone. This was because print technologies became, as William McGregor explains, a powerful set of metaphors to explain the abstract, invisible workings of perception and cognition, to conceptualize in terms of printmaking how sensations get recorded in the mind and retrieved from the memory as discrete units of knowledge. Similarly, as adeptly summarized by Ruth Noyes, this was an age that explained, as she wrote, disparate phenomena ranging from optical phenomena, visual perception, memory, formation, and recollection to natural procreation and generation, as well as religious conversion, suffering, and the miraculous, in terms of incising, imprinting, impressing. In other words, people began to explain learning and lots of other things as printing. Information was printed on the eye, stamped in the heart, engraved in the mind. This, what we might call circular association of print with cognition, was not confined to written metaphors, as the language of cognitive printing in turn reaffirmed the authority of real printed texts and images. Talking about information printing on the brain, never to be erased, made people think that printed material had real power and authority. In her study of early printmaking, Alina Gertzman explains the chain of imprints and incisions that begin with the woodcutter's knife, the engraver's burin, and the type founder's graver, and continues with the impressions on paper, the brain, the memory, the eye, the heart, culminates in the imprinting and transformation of one's entire soul. End quote. The viewer who read a printed text or gazed upon a holy print or printed portrait had this image and its truths represented, made indelible in his mind. Mexican viewers similarly understood that to estampar, grabar, or imprimir knowledge on one's heart or mind was to make it permanent. In 1579, Fray Diego de Valadez explained that by means of images that imprint themselves in different areas of our minds, we can learn by what we find in those spaces. Fray Jerónimo de Mendieta likewise relied on the language of printedness to refer to the indelibility of acquired knowledge among his native charges, writing that doctrine imprinted in their memories from a tender age. In this 1701 Peruvian engraving that we see on the left, love for the Spanish King Charles II, and if you know Charles II, you know he was kind of hard to love, nevertheless imprinted itself on his subjects. The closing couplet in the accompanying sonnet declares that, quote, when he is taken from their eyes, Charles remains printed on their hearts. So the vida of Maria Inés de los Dolores provides additional clear examples more closely associated with our topic. Metaphors of printing to explain her learning and internalization of Christian doctrine abound throughout the book, as they do in most vidas. She prayed to St. Ignatius that he print on her soul his generous spirit. When God took her sight at an early age, he printed in her interior a special kind of clarity and light. As she entered the convent, her virtues of faith, humility, obedience, hope, and fortitude engraved themselves on her heart. Purity and her love of God imprinted themselves in her soul. Her love of Christ was so great that it seemed more like she had it printed and engraved on her heart, and so on. Therefore, the book held next to the heart in a nun's portrait, as so many are, speaks of the indelible transmission of learned information into the nun's heart and mind. The portrait on the right almost seems to visualize this act, one hand on the book and the other pointing at the heart. That information printed indelibly in the heart and mind might be devotional. Nuns had prescribed lists of exemplary texts to read and time allowed daily for reading these works, or it might be biographical. Perhaps we should be reading the book in the painted portrait, not just as a book, but as books in general. If we can do this, the book in the nun's hand or beside her on the table can be a Bible, a theological treatise, or a prayer book. And it can be the book of her own life, the vida that captured her and repackaged her for public consumption, the thing that allowed her to be known far beyond those lucky enough to see her in life or in her painted portrait. And this vida was another type of portrait. That is, the book in her hand is her as well. Her finger penetrates its pages, making the woman and the book connected. This connection between the book and the nun herself is vividly made in the printed vida of Sor Maria Inés de los Dolores. Dedicating a funeral sermon in her vida to the sisters of her convent, Andrés de San Miguel writes that the deceased nun, now in the form of the book, passes again through the doors of this holy cloister. She returns printed and stamped so that you venerable women can read in her the practical exercises of the virtues she exhibited. The purpose of this reinvention in printed form by both typographic and engraved was observation, emulation, and learning as her living successors see her, imitate her, and know her. The author likened the text of her life to the ancestor portraits that the ancient Romans kept in their homes, so that having always the images before their eyes, they were moved to imitate them. But it's important to remember that neither the printed portrait nor the printed texts were true images of her, despite the claim of being a verdadero retrato, or true portrait on the engraving. Scholarship on the published vidas is unanimous in its assessment of these works as carefully crafted versions of the nuns' lives, written by male clerics who hewed closer or farther to reality in order to present the public the church's vision of exemplary Christian womanhood. This is demonstrated by how formulaic all of the vidas are. Similarly, remember that the portrait printed in her vida was not the reality of Inés's likeness. It was the miraculous transformation with age and suffering gone from her face. Here too, she was improved for public consumption. In the same way, when it came to the engraved portrait included in the vida of Madre Maria Ignacia de Aslor in the exhibition, the book's publisher and engraver did not reproduce her painted portrait seen here in the center. Instead, they grafted the face from her painted portrait onto the body and setting from the portrait of another of the convent's nuns, Maria Ana Teresa Bonstedt, which we see on the right. Why? Bonstedt's portrait fit the formula better and more fully told the story of Aslor and her role in the convent's administration than her own portrait did. And the printed medium allowed for this kind of editing. To return to our metaphors of printing, it turns out that there's a great deal of combining religious women with printed material in Mexican culture. A particularly charming example is this 1782 printer's proof from Mexico City's Nueva Madrileña Press. It features a small engraving of the Virgin of Sorrows and typographic passages printed in various fonts and sizes to demonstrate what the publisher had to offer. Each passage merges actual print in the typeface letters, printing metaphors, and the Virgin Mary, referring to her as a book, a press, and a printer for her Holy Son. Her soul was prepared to receive the imprint of sacred history. Her heart was imprinted with Christ's pain, and her press, her physical body, did not fail in the face of intense suffering. For his part, Christ is in the printer's proof, is the book printed by God with royal privilege, a play on typographic approvals and monopolies. Thus, we see the print signifying the person of Mary and Mary signifying print, allowing us to see the printed book and the painted portrait to represent the book of the nun's life, which is, after all, the sanitized and filtered version of the nun herself. But there's another aspect of the printer's proof that I believe helps us to interpret the printed materials in the painted portraits. And this is the persistent connection between pain or suffering, Mary, and printing. One passage reads, "For Christ in agony, you were the book and printer. You promptly copied, Senora, the pain that God perpetrated." Another, "Now your soul prepared in the temple of Solomon got ready for printing the most sacred history on Calvary made with red ink or blood, showing that your pain represents the event so exactly that it cannot be found thus the most minor error." And finally, so as not to belabor the point, "And thus, suffering dove, on your holy soul, the history by the same author of life stayed printed. My contemplation finds one letter in each wound that in your soul resides. And thus never was said more truly that lessons are taught with blood." The message is clear. Printing wounds, causes suffering, draws blood. The connection of printing and pain was not unique to Mexico in the 18th century. Here's a British 17th century emblem book by Christopher Harvey. The book's lengthy title is "The School of the Heart," or "The Heart of Itself Gone Away from God, Brought Back Again to Him and Instructed by Him." That's the title of the book. Emblem 15 is titled "Humiliation of the Heart." The illustration shows the heart being squeezed under a press. The motto beneath the emblem reads, "The heart too high, its lofty pride would read, if not pressed down and kept within its sphere." A stanza within the ode instructs God, "Slack not thine hand, Lord, turn thy screw about. If thy press stands, mine heart may chance slip out." As we saw earlier, learned information was said to be metaphorically printed on the heart under a press. Here, the Peruvian print that visualizes this on the right, squashing the heart under the press's weight. And from the emblem comes the information that the heart is squeezed while passing beneath this press. The squeezing is painful and humiliating. The pain of the press humbles the heart. And as Elena Gertzman has revealed, this pain was directly tied to printing and printmaking. Images of Christ suffering in a wine press, which is the same basic mechanics as the letterpress, came to be associated with printing, as in these two 15th century European woodcuts. Christ's blood became red ink, the wounds on his body like the sharp cuts made with the woodcutter's knife. The machinery of the wine press became the machinery of the printing press. As Gertzman writes, "When the blood of ink was rolled onto the flesh of the wood, the cross beam of the printing press would bear down on the sheet of paper, pressing the wood block and the paper in much the same way as the beam of the wine press bears down on Christ's body and the print itself. The press is a sophisticated vehicle for torture, designed as a mnemonic tool to serve several moments of the passion in the viewer's mind. In the act of making a print, just like in wounding Christ's body," Gertzman writes, "the body or wood was cut and the blood or ink was expressed on the flesh or paper by the weight of the press, akin in its mechanism to the wine press. In short, the press inflicted pain on Christ, who suffered for man's salvation." And this metaphor made its way to the Americas. Here, a woodcut from the Doctrina Cristiana en Lengua Huasteca, printed in Mexico in 1571, with Christ again under the press, his red blood or ink flowing from his body and collected in a chalice. The text surrounding the image reads, "I have stepped alone into the press for those who live. No man joins me." Which leads us back to Mexican nuns. Reading the Vidas reveals that exemplary nuns inflicted horrific abuses on their bodies as mortifications for their sinful natures. From the first chapter addressing her childhood, The text demonstrated that even in her youth, the future nun did not succumb to temptation. On the contrary, her body remained carefully controlled as a girl, as she, almost from birth, denied and violently abused herself. Starvation, flagellation, and a bizarre host of behaviors proved her faith and supposedly preserved her chastity. Even when her confessor, whom she otherwise obeyed completely, demanded that she moderate her abusive actions, the future nun persisted. Once in the convent, her self-abuse usually intensified as her body provided the opportunity to demonstrate physically her piety. As Catherine Ibsen explains, the manifestation of devotion through the manipulation and often the self-infliction of pain on the body was the most tangible, albeit equally dangerous, means of asserting sanctity. And while it's been suggested that bodily self-abuse described in the Vedas represented the women's attempts to assume some control over their lives, and they may well have operated as that in life and in the manuscript autobiographies, the printed biographies did not describe the behaviors as transgressive. Textual and visual representations of self-abuse, like these engravings of Sor Sebastiana and Madre Jerónima, solely operated in the biographies as signs of pious devotion and obedience to God. Sebastiana, for her part, starved herself, whipped her body, and carried rocks in her mouth. Jerónima tore the flesh from her back, stabbed herself with knitting needles, and wore a wire shirt that made her skin fall off. The fact that these and all other printed nuns' biographies include lengthy and explicit passages describing these behaviors suggests that this type of bodily abuse was widely accepted as a path to ideal Christian womanhood. I argue that printing and its connection to pain was another form of self-mortification, and it was manifested in the paintings by the printed book. Again, the Vida of the blind nun Inés de los Dolores supports this interpretation. Stating that Inés returned to her convent now in book form for the edification of her sisters, the text states that she had passed through the crushing of the letterpress and the torture of the roller press, the press used for printing engravings. This implied that the physical agony required to reconstitute the nun as a book and a print was augmented by the psychic suffering the printing press caused her. The author writes, "I do not doubt that if news of this printed book of her life would have reached her while alive, she would have first chosen the rack for her whole body than the press for her printing. First, the rack, a medieval torture device, upon which to be rigorously stretched, then the press upon which to be praised." But mortification was not only self-abuse, it was self-denial, and reading printed books was part of it. Mortification, according to the Jesuit writer Juan de la Cerda, meant taking away fine clothes and a comfortable bed to pray instead, staying away from conversations, fasting, and inflicting discipline or self-abuse. Further, mortification included being in every way obedient to superiors and to complying with vows. This included reading, and Cerda said that a nun's knees should always be tired from holding sacred books while reading. If mortification included avoiding pleasurable things, complying with the orders of the convent superiors and her confessors, and compulsory periods of reading, the nun engaged in mortification each time she read one of the prescribed books on the daily schedule. Remember also that Núñez de Miranda described the difficulty and discomfort women experienced while reading. In fact, the rules and constitutions of the order of a Dominican convent in Puebla, Mexico, admonished abbesses to take great care that her charges complied with their daily readings and to have on hand the recommended books for spiritual sustenance, not diversion. Nuns were to be kept constantly busy, and reading was listed alongside work as a task to occupy the nuns' days. And readings also ordered the nuns to commit acts of physical pain. The small devotional books we see painted in the hands of the professing nuns, like the novena included in the exhibition upstairs, routinely called upon the readers to engage in self-mortification. A popular text written by a Poor Clare nun advised readers meditating on the fifth station of the cross. Do your discipline here. Once the discipline is finished, pray one credo face down on the ground. Another, written by an anonymous Mexican author and dedicated to the nuns of the Santísima Trinidad in Puebla, instructed readers to confess and take communion and perform repeated acts of contrition, humility, and mortification. Another author provided similar instructions, adding, "Your spiritual father," meaning your confessor, "will tell you the interior and exterior mortification exercises you are to employ," making clear that the use of cilices and scourges that we see in the portraits were sanctioned by the church. Hence, reading in Mexican convents was not a source of pleasure. It was painful discipline. I would like to suggest that knowing the connection between printing and pain, that the printed books in painted portraits of nuns additionally signify mortification as the instrument of inflicting pain, or at least denying pleasure, the directive to commit the painful and uncomfortable acts, and the object containing descriptions of the nun's own self-abuse. Here now we circle back to Núñez de Miranda's statement about nuns keeping their reading skills hidden and covered up, only to be shown when the convent needed them. It stands to reason that the convent needed the printed books and the nuns' portraits to embody this life of self-denial in a palatable package. Hanging in a family home, the book was, in addition to a symbol of reading, a convenient and subtle sign of a life of self-abuse and self-denial. And lest we balk at so subtle a sign connecting books and sacrifice, Mexican painter José de Ibarra made it the central theme in his immense painting for the Puebla Cathedral. Here we see the Lamb of God resting atop the Book of the Apocalypse with its 7 seals, and adored by saints who bore the faces of Puebla's church leaders. While paintings abound in the Western tradition of the Lamb on the book, either open or closed, or bleeding atop it, this painting interestingly pinches the lamb's foot between its pages, a subtle sign of pain and sacrifice. The connection between the portrait's printed books and pain may also be seen in a late 18th century engraving of the Virgin Mary, in which Mary reads from a small devotional book. She is presented as she appears in familiar images of the Mater Dolorosa, with a heavy mantle and downturned head. But rather than swords piercing her chest, Mary's pain in this case is gently signified by the index finger inexplicably caught between the pages that tell the story of her own sorrows. Like Sor María Inés de los Dolores, Mary suffers in this image from printing's pain, as she is engraved in the likeness, as her sorrows are printed in the book, and as her finger is pressed between its pages. And finally, a Mexican painting of one of the miracles of St. Teresa of Avila's life happens amongst her Discalced Carmelite sisters who read from their books. But only the 2 whose fingers are pinched between the book's pages are rewarded with witnessing the event, their additional mortification earning them a vision of the Virgin Mary's miracle. And the 2 that have the fingers pinched are here and here. To conclude, it's clear to me that our initial reading of the books pictured in Mexican 18th century nuns' portraits only scratched the surface. The printed book held in a nun's hand, resting on a table beside her as one of the very few signs included in the painting, tells us much more than we initially believed. It is, of course, the body of rules of her order and an expression of her devotion, but it is also her life, recast and improved through the translation of a male biographer. It is her divine husband and her relationship with him. It is her obedience to the order. It is her knowledge indelibly printed on her heart and mind. It is her suffering. And as she grasps it in her hand or places it on her table, it is the sign that the nun was transformed into the exemplary Christian woman. Thank you.
All right, we can open the floor for questions.
In many of the images, the nuns' badges are shown. You touched on that a little bit last week. Were those badges individualized for each nun? Did every nun have one? Were there different ones for different orders? Did they wear them, or were they just symbolic and shown in the images? Could you comment a little bit more on the badges, please?
Sure. The badges were not common to all orders. Only a couple of them had badges. And the painting would be commissioned just as a painting would for any display in a household. The commission would establish what the iconography would be. And so the women would choose the representation. Usually it's the Virgin Mary. So is she the Immaculate Conception? Is she the Virgin of Guadalupe or some other abdication? And then choose what saints to array around her. It stands to reason that painters also kept a kind of standard stock of these things available, since they are fairly consistent in the way that they present their theme. And so it wouldn't be a stretch to believe that somebody had kind of some typical examples ready to go. They were worn. They were either sewn into the habit or suspended from the habit. And whether they wore them as they were laboring in the kitchen, I would doubt that. But certainly as they were participating in the daily prayer sessions, they'd be worn, and they'd be worn for any sort of ceremony. Anytime they entered the choir, they would need to be worn. And they had with them, they were surrounded by a tortoiseshell frame, typically. Some also had more embellished frames in silver or gilded material that has since been removed and put on a stand. So frequently you'll see them exhibited in museums on a metal stand.
How did a nun merit a portrait? Was it just the holiest women? And were they kept in the convents, or were they also exhibited to the public?
The ones that were done for profession were kept in the woman's home, or family home, unless it was donated as part of her dowry to enter the convent. Those that were made of women who were farther along, sometimes they had 25-year anniversary portraits. Others were done as they died. Those typically also stayed in the convent. They would be exhibited for the women of the convent rather than put in public areas of the church. So they would typically be in chapter rooms and other areas within the cloister to which people did not have access. And those were painted for women who were sort of the best and brightest, the who stayed the long, survived the longest, who were renowned for their work as this. So not everybody it wasn't like school pictures. Everybody didn't get a portrait at 25 years.
You mentioned that the nuns were urged by their spiritual directors to maintain a diary. I assume that diary was of their sins. That would be my guess. And I wonder at the end of their life, or even during their lives, if those diaries became the possessions of the spiritual director, and if so, what purpose was that for? And are those diaries, have they become available at this day and age to read and understand what was in them?
Mm-hmm. The contents of the diaries are interesting because they really run the gamut. Yes, it's thoughts on how she was succumbing to temptation in whatever way she succumbed to temptation, but it was also dreams she had or experiences she had within the convent, thoughts, meditations on Christ and Mary and the saints. And so they're quite diverse in their contents, rather than they themselves are not terribly formulaic, even though the books that are based on them become very formulaic. They remained within the convent. And so unless the confessor thought that she was somebody who had the likelihood of becoming a saint or needing a campaign toward beatification and sainthood, it just remained with the convent. And so there are plenty of examples that still exist and have been studied by scholars. I've never seen one in person myself. I don't work within convents, in convent archives, but they are still available and are now increasingly getting published without the filter of the male cleric who sort of reinterprets and cleans it up and gives it a narrative, because they're not really narrative. They're just like any diary. Here's today, here's my thought. So they transform them into a typical biography format, birth through death and postmortem miracle.
I wonder if you'd mind going back to Sotomayor's Sor Maria painting, and then there's another painting I want to ask about. Okay. Not
Maria Inés de los Dolores?
No, the one where there's the sisters are behind, are standing behind her. It was earlier.
Oh. In the choir?
Yes.
Yeah. That's a painting of Saint Monica. And yeah.
Okay. Who is standing with the sisters?
So what they're presenting it as is the display of Monica's body after death. So she's represented as being in the choir, where her body would be displayed through the celosías, through that grate that we talked about last time. And then the people behind are members of the community who've come to pay their respects, hopefully not take any relics through the grill. So that's who they are in the background.
Oh, and then the other one is Herrera's Santa Juanita. No, I think it's Juana. Anyway, the earlier, let's see here. Right.
This one?
Yeah, that one. Now, on the right here, Herrera's, the ring. The ring, is it on the second finger?
Yeah, it's on her middle finger.
Would it typically, is this the ring as the Bride of Christ ring? So it didn't necessarily would be on the third finger, right? I've noticed sometimes it is, some don't have a ring and so forth.
Yeah, and some have multiple rings on multiple fingers. I'm not sure when the convention of wedding ring on the ring, what we call the ring finger, became standard.
Oh, yeah, that's true. One more, Madre Dolores, right near the end. Let's see. That doesn't seem right. There's another one right near the very end. I think it might have been one of the very last one. That one, back.
Back?
Yeah, back. One back.
One back.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Why are there the dice with the other instruments of pain?
I assume that that's drawing from the instruments of the Passion. And one of the instruments of the Passion, those sort of objects that get associated with Christ's final days, are the dice, the lots that were cast at the base of the cross.
Is that a candle holder, or is that on our left?
Yeah, it appears to be a chalice. So for collecting
and how does
blood.
how does that tie in with the instruments of suffering?
My guess on this one, it's a non-standard iconography, but what it's doing is it's combining a couple of moments, including the standard image of Christ crucified with angels collecting his blood to reference the Eucharist. And so we're blending moments here.
And that's the crown of thorns. And then what's on our right here? Yeah, it looks like something.
It's a hand, and I don't know what that represents.
Okay.
It almost looks like a suit of armor's glove.
Oh yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah, okay, that could be a Roman soldier's glove, and part of the suffering all of that's just a scene from the crucifixion.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
This will be the final question.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really enjoyed, probing the simpler reading of, what the significance of the book is. I'm wondering though, your analysis of the metaphor of the book as printed material, do you think that also extends to the representations of printed imagery within the nun portraits?
Mhm. Yeah, I do. And I think that this is, I have an article on that came out in 2008, I think. And that by including these printed images on the walls, what they're saying is, yes, on the surface, it is, she had a print on the wall of herself, but it's also making a bunch of other statements. One being a print is a poor artistic medium, so she's illustrating her vow of poverty. It's also a reference to, in other contexts, so when it shows up, for example, in an image of Christ, sometimes you'll see Christ with a print. It's modernizing it, bringing it to now, since printing proudly proclaimed that it was a modern technology. Even the Romans didn't have it. We're so wonderful. And so it has multiple levels of meaning that gets attached to it.
Well, I'd like to thank you so much, Dr. Donahue
Thank
Wallace,
you.
for this fantastic way to end our series. Thank you. And I'd like to thank you as well as Miranda Saylor for putting this series together and presenting, I think, so much new information for many of us.